Welcome to Coburn Conversations. This is a seminar event that Coburn Place puts on a few times a year where we talk about specific issues surrounding domestic violence. Today's topic is about what survivors need when they're seeking help. I want to take a second to thank our generous sponsor, Geico, who presented this event today. And I also want to introduce myself. My name is Julie Henson, and I am the Vice President of Development at Coburn Place. At Coburn Place, our vision is to illuminate a path forward to restore hope and promote healing for survivors and their kids. We do that by working together with community partners, with donors, with volunteers, with staff to offer compassionate support and safe housing choices. And at any given time, we can offer housing choices to 120 families, as well as compassionate care to help them build stability, focus on healing, and create their own unique fresh starts. If you have questions throughout, we will have a Q&A at the end of this. But if you have questions throughout that you don't want to forget, feel free to drop those in the chat, and we are going to collect them in a different document. We also are going to be live tweeting this on Twitter. So if you love Twitter and you're on there right now and you want to follow along, the hashtag is #Coburn Conversations. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our speakers. Professor Deborah Epstein and Professor Lisa Goodman. These two women are incredible professionals, and they have done so much for the domestic violence field. For the sake of getting them to have time to share their results, I'm not going to read their full bios, but their bios are amazing. We are very grateful that they're spending this hour with us. Deborah is the director of the Georgetown University's Law Center's Domestic Violence Clinic, which is representing hundreds of women in civil protection order cases and training hundreds of students to advocate for the rights of DV survivors. She co-chaired the design and implementation of the DC Superior Court's Domestic Violence Division. She also co-directed its Domestic Violence Intake Center. Professor Epstein has also served as the chair of the DC Domestic Violence Fatality Review Board and as a member of the DC Mayor's Commission on Violence Against Women, the DC Superior Court Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, and the board of directors at both the DC Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the House of Ruth Shelter Program. Lisa Goodman is a clinical community psychologist and professor in the Department of Counseling and Applied Developmental Psychology at Boston College. Her research highlights the strengths and needs of marginalized survivors, including communities of color and people who are unhoused. She's written more than 120 articles and chapters on these topics, and she's received grants from the National Institute of Justice and the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Goodman consults for national and local domestic violence organizations, and she's the co-founder of the Domestic Violence Program Evaluation and Research Collaborative. She's received national awards for teaching and mentoring excellence, including the Elizabeth Hurlock Beckman Award. Professors Dr. Epstein, Dr. Goodman, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I'm going to give this over to you to share a study that you have been working on that talks about what survivors need when they are seeking help.
Great. So if we could just pull up the PowerPoint, we can, awesome. Okay, let me just, oops, how can sorry. Okay. Thank you. So I think we'll just jump straight to the next slide and start off with some acknowledgements. We'll say more about this later, but obviously one of our major partners in this study was Coburn Place, and we are just unbelievably grateful to you guys for your collaboration with us on this and other studies that Lisa and I have been working on. But I will also want to acknowledge we had several co-researchers on this project, Nkiru Nawalazy from the University of Baltimore in Maryland, was another researcher on this project. And then 3 of Lisa's graduate students, Emily Zhang, Helen Hales, and Allison Slocum, all at Boston College with Lisa. And then, as you'll hear a little bit later, we had an advisory board that helped us, and their names are on the slide. You can take a look at those. And then, of course, we're super, super grateful to the 25 women who shared their stories with us as we engaged in this research. So I'm just going to ask you to do the next slide. Every time I do that, it reminds me of my medical researcher father, who used to do that so often that sometimes he would say that at the dinner table. I'm not used to someone else doing my slides for me. Thank you. Okay, so this project, the story behind it, what prompted it, we want to just ground you in that. In the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, we know that there was a greatly expanded national conversation about the harms that arise at the intersection of race and policing. And this conversation has focused largely on expanding community-based interventions that may be a better fit than police responses, and with a particular focus on situations that, while urgent, are predominantly about homelessness, mental health challenges, substance use, and less about violent crime. So within the domestic violence field in particular, these conversations have really ignited a sense of urgency among intimate partner violence advocates, some of whom had not fully understood the race-based harms that permeate the criminal legal system, or fully understood how these harms can negatively affect survivors and their families. So a broad swath of anti-domestic violence movement activists and advocates have really been catalyzed by these national events to take a hard, critical look at long-standing ideas about how to best respond to intimate partner violence. So just one example of this shift can be seen in a statement called the Moment of Truth, Statement of Commitment to Black Lives. This was a statement signed on to by 46 domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions across the country, who really denounced the way the movement has relied so heavily on police and prosecutors and prisons as the primary go-to solutions for intimate partner violence. They also called all of us to account for the ways in which this strategy has really failed many survivors who are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. So the statement calls for a shift away from the criminal legal system to be replaced by community solutions like restorative and transformative justice. So could we do the next? No, wait, sorry, not the next slide. I think you have a different version of the PowerPoint than I do. Okay, so there's a growing interest in community solutions here. But what we lack at this point is systematic data from survivors themselves. Can we go back a slide? Especially with respect to moments of significant danger, which are the moments when the police are most likely to be called. So what do survivors actually do in those moments? What do they want in terms of the ways which we could expand their options beyond just police? So as we think about these community-based option expansions, it is critical that we hear from survivors themselves directly. And that's what we set out to do in the study. We set out to learn more about who do survivors already reach out to when they're in moments of danger, separate and apart from whether they might also call the police. What factors, including factors that might exist at an individual, interpersonal, and broader contextual level, what factors influence survivors' goals and decisions about who to reach out to and whether to reach out in those moments? Okay, so next slide. So the next question is, what do we already know? And 2 different streams of research inform this project. First, we already know a lot about survivors' use of informal networks in non-emergency moments. And some of the researchers who've taught us a lot about this are listed at the bottom of the slide. And Lisa Goodman is one of them. We know that survivors lean on informal networks before, during, and sometimes instead of more formal sources of support. One example of this that illustrates this is a study that was done of 114 white, Latinx, and Black survivors who had been receiving domestic violence services across 4 different metropolitan areas in the US. And that study found that 93.9%, really huge number, had sought informal support before they turned to informal services. So we know informal networks play a huge role. But we've also learned that when survivors lean on their informal networks, they sometimes do so reluctantly. They might fear that their networks are exhausted and fed up with them because they've relied on them so much. They might feel shame or worry about being misunderstood or judged about their decisions in the relationship. Or some of them express wanting to feel strong. Researchers had found that Black women sometimes report a need to live up to, fulfill what Patricia Hills Collins calls the controlling image of the strong Black woman. And this image can sometimes take the form of a stereotype, but it can also create an expectation for behavior that survivors may internalize, okay? So that's survivors are sometimes reluctant to lean on their informal networks, but we also know that sometimes survivors don't rely on their informal networks at all. And finally, we know that sometimes network members turn out to be extremely helpful. Sometimes they are far from it. Okay, that's what we know. What we don't know is what do survivors do in critical moments of danger? And as far as we know, there's been no systematic research on this question until this study. Can we do the next slide? Okay. And second strand of research about what we already know that informed this project shows that advocates are extremely interested in paying attention to survivors' informal support networks. And in one study that Lisa conducted with some of her colleagues, she interviewed almost every single advocate in a northeastern state in a focus group method. And what they found was that most of those advocates took some form of what Lisa calls a network-oriented approach. That is a set of practices that are designed to strengthen survivors' relationship with people in their networks in ways that support their healing, their safety, and their well-being. And those practices included things like helping survivors identify the network members who were helpful versus those who were harmful, helping survivors find new ways to engage with their existing networks, often following a period when survivors felt there was a disconnection and a disruption of their network. It also included helping survivors develop new relationships when old ones were simply not available, and or working directly with network members to help them support survivors effectively, okay? The thing that's particularly interesting, I think, about this, what we know about what advocates are doing, is that most of this advocacy work was not what the advocates were actually assigned to do, right? Charged with at their work. Instead, it was work that they kind of did around the edges when they had time. Almost to a person, they really wanted to center this kind of work far more, but typically there were no funding streams for it, no designated resources to support it, no training offered. So we know the door is really open for this kind of work. Survivors rely heavily on informal support networks, and we know advocates are really interested in centering these networks, but we're just at the beginning, right? There's much, much more work to be done. So let's get to our study. So let's do the next slide. 3 big ideas framed the approach we took here. The first was we wanted to partner with community programs to help us elicit the perspectives of survivors directly. We wanted to highlight survivor experiences, and we also wanted to get their recommendations for the future, for how we could reform things. And we also hoped, and this is what we're doing today, to share our findings with partnering programs so that survivors could have a meaningful impact on the programs that they themselves actually used. And we really wanted to ensure that there was a strong representation from survivors who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, given the centrality of people in those groups in the discussion about alternatives to policing. Okay, second, we wanted the insight of a range of stakeholders as we developed the study. And we sought that input, those insights, in two different ways. First, we conducted a focus group at the very outset, well, before we really launched the study, with a large group of advocates at one of our partnering programs, and they helped us to frame the right questions to ask based on their experiences in working with survivors. And then second, we formed an advisory group. And that group, which we went through the names in the very first slide, it was comprised of scholars and policymakers and survivors from across the country. And we checked in with them to get their input periodically, particularly when we started to pull together our findings and think about how to best interpret them. Okay, finally, we took a relational and ecological approach to the study. So what we were doing is trying to understand in depth how study participants made their decisions in the context of their perceptions about themselves, about their relationships, about their social contexts. Okay, next slide. Here's a little bit about our methods and our sample. We worked with community partners across the country, Coburn Place being the best and our favorite, but we also worked with programs in New York City, in Kentucky, and in Chelsea, Mass. To recruit participants, advocates sent out flyers, and survivors who received them then reached out to us by email. We interviewed a total of 25 participants. As you can see on the slide, 18 identified as Black or African American, 6 as white, 1 as Native American. They were all English speaking, all but 1 was born in the US. Half were employed. The age range varied quite a bit, 21 to 61 with a mean of 36. They had 23 of the 25 had at least 1 child, and 20 of the 25 had spent time in shelter, although we found no difference in the stories we heard between those who had or had not spent time in shelter. We paid every participant $50. And this was recently, so we conducted our interviews over Zoom. And I'm going to ask for the next slide, which gets you to the questions that we asked. So we start out getting to know each other a little bit, sort of doing some chit chat, connecting across Zoom. And then we asked the first big question. And this question came out of that initial focus group of advocates that I just mentioned. And that was, I'm going to ask you to think about times when you or your children were deeply scared and unsafe because of your partner. Times when the situation went beyond your capacity to deal with it on your own and it felt like a real emergency. And then we would follow up by saying, can you tell me about the first time you felt like that? And then the scariest time, the most recent time. We often heard about many incidents that survivors felt were real emergencies beyond their capacity to deal with it on their own. And then after hearing about that, we followed up with, who did you reach out to? Why? What happened? And is this what you wanted? Okay, next slide. So the next question is, how did participants define and describe that real emergency we were asking about? And in their responses to this opening general question, it became clear how they thought about it, what constituted a real emergency. Generally, survivors identified a moment of dangerous change in their partner's behavior, such as when the violence became more severe, escalated a bit, when the partner lost control, or when the participant herself felt suddenly and completely powerless because of the partner's actions. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to keep going.
Okay, thank you so much, Deborah. And before I dive in, let me say how happy I am to be here. And I just love Indiana. You guys are just, look how many of you are here. I'm very moved by your commitment to survivors. So thank you for inviting us. And so now I'm going to just dive right into the heart of our findings. So next slide, please. So first of all, what about the police? Let me say very briefly that about 3/4 of the sample did call the police at least once during one of the emergency moments they described. Some called the police as a first resort. Some called the police because it was just, they had no other option. Those who reached out to their informal networks, which is what you're going to hear about next, sometimes also called the police and sometimes did not. The same was true for people who did not reach out to their informal networks. So what's really important here about the police is the lack of any kind of correlation between the strength of a survivor's informal network and her decision to call the police in a moment of acute danger. So we know that survivors often prefer not to rely on the police. One would think that those with stronger networks, therefore, would have called the police less often, presumably because they had other options. But that did not turn out to be the case, which means to me that it's possible that even in the best situation where people have robust informal networks, that may not be sufficient to address every instance of acute violence, which makes intuitive sense since informal networks are not trained or equipped to intervene in violent situations. So just want you to bookmark this finding. We're going to discuss later. This finding has implications, I think, for how we explore alternatives that would give survivors additional options that are neither informal networks nor the police. Participants had something to say about this, so we'll come back to that. So let's move on now, next slide, please, to what happens when they did reach out to people in their networks or tried to. So first of all, this is a headline. A full half of the participants reached out to no one, either most or all of the time. I'm going to talk more about why that is in a few minutes. What I want to say here is that this finding kind of brings to light something that has been obscured in the prior research that Deborah mentioned earlier about how people turn to their survivors turn to their informal networks before, during, and after, or instead of their formal networks. So yes, that is true. However, our study did not sort of contradict that, but it adds a piece, because these prior studies, they focused on participants' informal outreach in general. They were not asking specifically about each incident, each separate time they needed somebody. So we really took a systematic approach to understanding specific concrete events across time. And that approach provided a new insight, which is that even for those survivors who had reached out over the course of their relationship to informal networks, even for survivors who found those efforts helpful, even those survivors often experienced plenty of dire emergency moments when they did not feel able to reach out to anyone from their informal networks. Nobody, zero, which I think is a really important and sobering finding as we think about like restorative justice and other kinds of community engagement. As I said, I'll come back to why that might be in a few minutes. But I want to say that still, although some did reach out to their networks at least some of the time. And when they did, it was mainly to family members, friends, and neighbors. Their choices of who to reach out to were based on 3 criteria. First, and by far the most important, very simply, they wanted to reach out to somebody who would not judge them. This finding, as we'll discuss, is pretty striking given that this is a moment of crisis and danger, and that's what they're thinking about. Who will not judge me? So then second, the second most common response to how they picked who to reach out to is they wanted people who could provide practical assistance, like a place for the person to stay or somebody to pick her up. And then third, kind of is an obvious one, they wanted to pick someone who lived close by. Next slide, please. So the next question is, what did survivors receive when they did reach out? Many network responses survivors described as very painful. They talked about being discredited, disbelieved, a network member simply refusing to provide help, a network member telling her what to do in a way that just felt more confusing, not less, or network members conditioning assistance on their leaving the relationship. Like, I'll help you, but you got to get out, you got to stay out, kind of thing. And then there was another group of survivors who said that sometimes and often this is the same group at different events, described helpful responses like, yes, I will give you a place to stay. Yes, I will give you transportation out of the violent situation. I will come to the scene to serve as a supportive presence, or very occasionally, I will call the police. And a very few, the smallest group, provided the very kind of support that participants named as the #1 thing they wanted, which was empathic and non-judgmental listening. Next slide, please. So now we get to the influences, like why, the why. Influences on why participants felt that they had no one to call most of the time, and that when they did, the responses were so problematic for them. The first thing participants often spoke about when we asked the why question, like, so if you didn't call the police, or if you didn't call someone, not the police, anyone, why not? The first thing they often talked about was family rupture. And they talked about that in a variety of ways. First, they talked about intergenerational trauma. So they often noted that the mothers, grandmothers, siblings, or even friends in their lives had themselves suffered violent victimization, child abuse or neglect, partner violence, sexual assault, or community violence within their own families. And they described how in some families, this intergenerational trauma resulted in a kind of a desensitized perspective, like these things just happen. As one participant put it, she said, my grandma, she stayed with a man that was abusing her. My dad, he stayed with a woman that was abusing him. My sister's still married to a guy that is abusing her. And it's like, it's a family pattern. It was always, you got to work it out. You got to stick with it. They never tell you how to leave. So I kept quiet for a long time. Then for others, there was this intergenerational trauma rendering their support networks too emotionally overwhelmed to listen in a meaningful way. One person described this as like a constant triggering. She said, I wouldn't tell my mom or wouldn't call my mom because it would just trigger her and she wouldn't be able to help me. She needs to heal before I can heal. So those were some of the ways that intergenerational trauma, this big kind of distal out there experience, nonetheless filtered down into the survivor's immediate experience in a crisis. Then also regarding family fragmentation, many talked about systemic intrusion. That is, stories about child protective services splitting up their families in ways that they never recovered from. And so, you know, they said, oh, ever since I had to go live in foster care, one after another, I haven't kept in touch with my family, haven't kept in touch with the foster family. I have no one. And then even less frequently, they describe family disruption due to conditions like addiction or incarceration or homelessness. And then finally, they just talked about physical distance as the main barrier to seeking help. I want to also say that there were people who described amazing, strong families who would do anything for the survivor. But they were, and who were there for the survivor, who came when called, who stood there as menacing presences, who did all kinds of things. But they were by far the exception to the main picture that is developing here. So next slide, please. Another big set of influences on their ability to reach out was that even if there was someone in their lives, they didn't feel like they could reach out because of the messages they had received from their networks, that they heard as networks tolerating domestic violence as a necessary evil, networks lacking understanding of domestic violence dynamics, networks blaming them for inciting or provoking the violence, networks disbelieving them, as was mentioned before, intergenerational trauma piece, and networks disapproving of or disappointed by or fed up with their decisions related to safety, like networks who were really helpful at some point had just pulled away for reasons that we can all imagine. Again, there were a few exceptions. I think this is really interesting. Several people described best friends from much earlier in life being there for them. They would call somebody they hadn't talked to in 10 years, and that was the person who really helped them out. Or in one case that was just very moving, they described a brother who really got it. And she said would send messages like all the time. He would just send message to me like, you're valuable, you're worth something, you're loved. And you're going to hear in a few minutes how, again, not necessarily intuitive, but how that message affected her in the crisis moment. Next slide, please. So the next, and I think second to last set of influences on her experience of network support was survivors' orientation to relationships. So the family ruptures and the network messages in turn created in most survivors we interviewed a set of really limiting self-images in terms of how they saw themselves in relation to others, what in my field we call relational images. And these also contributed to a tendency to choose to withdraw rather than reach out. So about half of them described a sense of profound aloneness. Like, well, one person said, I felt alone, I guess, because I feel like nobody truly knows my story. That's just one example of this sort of sense of them being sort of encased in ice, like there's just no one there. Many expressed profound distrust of other people, not seeing them as dependable, like people in general as dependable, or seeing them as out to take advantage of others' vulnerabilities. So one participant said, people don't always want to be a good person. They don't always have your best interests in mind. Some wanted to simply avoid the shame they felt that came with looking weak to others. One person said, I don't want to involve my family in it because I want to portray myself to them as being an independent person. I was embarrassed. I didn't want people to think that I would tolerate this. It's embarrassing because people know me to be a strong person, a smart person, someone that doesn't take crap. I don't want people to look down on me. And then the interviewer said, that was me, said, and that weighed stronger than the desire to get help? And she said, at that time, yes. For many, and actually most of the Black women in this study, the cultural stereotype of the strong Black woman that Deborah mentioned earlier, they articulated that. And that contributed to their own personal desire to appear resilient and independent. And then finally, many simply didn't want to burden anyone in their networks. And they said things like, this is a quote, that's just not the way I am. Again, there were some exceptions. And sort of movingly, I think that for Deborah and me, we saw this as a real strength of many of these survivors. There was those few that had reached desperately and bravely reached out to people that they had not seen for 10 years. And then what moved us so much was how many of them reached out to us, the interviewers, in the interview. When you hear all that I've just described, you might expect that we interviewed some really bound, defensive or armored people. And that was not the case. Many said, whoa, thank you for the opportunity. And many were extremely vulnerable. Maybe many asked us questions about how they could get more support. Many described this ability to just calmly and with one person and over a long period to describe what happened as itself really important, and gave them sort of a frame for thinking about it the next time they were in crisis. So I want to name those strengths in survivors despite all the armoring that I've just described. And then next slide, please. So the last set of influence is at the individual level rather than the relational level. And that has to do with survivors' sense of mattering. Ultimately, many of the survivors just didn't feel that they mattered to anyone. So what was the point of reaching out? They described not being important to network members, not being even seen by network members, and certainly not being cherished by them. Again, there were exceptions. So next slide, please. So overall, I just wanted you to get a picture of this cycle that sort of emerged from all of these data and all of these interviews. and all of the coding that we did. And the cycle or loop was that survivors described a sort of damaging cycle of intergenerational trauma and systemic intrusion, followed by negative messages from networks alongside relational orientations that really pushed for disconnection, all leading to and following from a sense of not mattering to anyone. So in the dangerous moment when survivors were terrified and unable to manage on their own, they often felt in that moment they had nowhere to turn to, no one to reach out to. And then when they didn't, this sort of pattern got reinforced. Next slide, please. So I want to turn now to what they wished for in the face of this kind of admittedly bleak picture. So we asked them, what did you really need in those moments? Either that you occasionally got or mostly got. Many didn't know, which I think is really interesting and makes sense once they start to describe it. They said things like, how could I know? In that moment, they described their heads were spinning, they were having an out-of-body experience, they couldn't think. I want to read you this amazing quote that illustrates this. This is the best thing that comes to mind. If I'm a baby and I busted my head open and I'm walking around and people are just looking at my head busted open, and I'm sitting up there and I'm just walking around with a busted head, and I don't realize what's going on because I can't see it. I know it hurts, but if I never get the care for it, it's like, I'm going to die. I don't even know how to go to somebody and say, hey, my head is busted. It's just unaware. It's oblivious. I couldn't tell people that I needed them to care. I just literally did not care about myself. And then I asked them, even in that moment of danger, you couldn't see what was happening? Yes, even in that moment. So just, dissociation and terror and chaos and not any clarity about what they needed. However, in retrospect, they could say, and many also did say, they needed, besides this woman, what they needed were the following. For the survivor to gain physical safety and respite through help calming him down, through, and I'm using these gendered pronouns because this just happened to be the sample, the heterosexual sample that we interviewed. Help calming him down, someone to pick her up, someone to give her a place to stay for a day or two, and then for the survivor to gain psychological respite. And one was not enough without the other, because the psychological respite is what enabled her to think. And what she meant by psychological respite is someone to listen without judgment and with empathy, the thing I referred to at the very start. So I want to just talk about this in a little more detail here. What the survivors talked about with respect to this non-judgmental listening is they needed someone to reflect back their experience in a way that would help them understand themselves, and then to respond to what they needed once they could figure it out. But they needed that what do I even need moment, and they felt they couldn't do that on their own. Survivors described in glowing terms how transformative it was when a friend or family member listened carefully, stayed with their perspective, and expressed love and a sense of valuing them. And again, this was by far the most cross-cutting and pervasive theme, and a surprising one. I just cannot stop sort of emphasizing this, that even in the moment of danger, even when the survivor's life was in danger, what she said she needed the most was a listening ear. I would say things like, even when you were in the bathroom with the door locked and him banging on the door, then, yes, then. And here's a quote that I think beautifully illustrates this. This is by a woman who was eventually able to receive emotional support from her brother at the emergency moment. She said, he gave me the type of help that I needed, just to hear, she called him, just to hear his voice, just to know that somebody still loved me out there. Her partner, the harming partners, find whatever weaknesses and whatever insecurities that you have, and they tear each one of those things apart to a point for somebody like me, who I knew had good self-esteem, can make you feel like the smallest particle of dirt on the ground. Sometimes just to hear that that's not how everybody thinks about you. It's everything in the world. It's empowerment. It gives you strength to say, it's the first step to say, wait a second, everything that you, partner, are saying about me is wrong. I need to leave. So I said in my still confused way, wait, you needed that at the moment of greatest danger? And she said, I guess it helps you to stop for a moment, rethink and regroup. You know how when Popeye the Sailor Man is getting weak and he's in a fight and he gets that spinach? I hope those of you all know that reference. She said, then he gets this internal strength. It gives you that mental and emotional strength to reevaluate the situation and sometimes figure out, is this a fight or flight situation? Can I de-escalate the situation? I don't know how to explain it. It can help you get the strength to even call the police or just get out of the situation or whatever. It gave me strength. It gave me serenity, a calmness to at least stop my partner in the situation. I was able to calm down, quiet myself, to self-reflect on some stuff. I think that was the starting point of me forming an escape plan. And then just one more quick quote. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking for a place to stay. I was really asking for somebody just to hold space for me. It's a different person. So I think what is crucial here is that for many participants, this kind of support was in very much short supply or entirely unavailable, at least in their view. And the reality that these women consistently had no friends or family to turn to, even when their lives were at stake. Even wanting this very simple thing, I'm unable to get it, is a matter of really profound concern, and one that, you know, we would all face. I want to say that none of us, if we imagine ourselves, can get through a complex and frightening situation alone. They are no different, these survivors. So next slide, please. So what do we do? The range of recommendations that participants had for domestic violence programs is, I think, particularly important given our finding about their dependence on the police, regardless of their network strength, as you will see. So they just suggested new areas for, you know, what we in our field call survivor-defined areas in several, survivor-defined practice in several different areas. First, they wanted us in the DV world to increase the capacity of their existing networks to be able to listen empathically, to understand survivor needs, to know how to play a role in dangerous moments that are aligned with what survivors need. So they wanted support for their network members. And they talked about a range of ways this could work. They talked about workshops or groups for network members. And then they also talked about opportunities for dialogue between the survivor and one of her network members, like her mother, like a mother-daughter pair, or a survivor plus a different network member of her choice. But somehow, some way to enable or facilitate work with network members. Then they also talked about the idea, several of them, about a buddy approach, where domestic violence programs would bring together a pair of survivors to work together to develop mutual trust and specific strategies that they could use in moments of crisis. And this approach, which the survivors in our study have offered, echoes actually the amazing work of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collaborative and disability activist Mia Mingus on pod mapping. So there's some ideas out there. In the pod mapping model, a pod is a set of people you can turn to for support in the face of violent, harmful, or abusive experiences, whether as survivors, bystanders, or people who have harmed others. And Mingus has this great pod mapping worksheet so that survivors can think about who they can trust and who they would want to get help from in advance. And I can actually put that link to that when I'm done talking to the worksheet. And then third, survivors talked about, and I think this is really, really interesting, new forms of physical respite. So these survivors were not talking to each other, and yet they all made, or many made a suggestion like the following. What they wanted was not a shelter that requires paperwork and rules and intake processes and is sometimes very confining and very isolating, not a hotel where they'd be completely alone and without any resources. But they talked about a safe place that they could go to for a few days to think, to decompress, to regain their bearings, to figure out next steps, and to have available and accessible for when they wanted it, the kind of listening that they have described over and over again needing so much. So that could be in the form of a phone call, like to call the advocate if and when they wanted to. There's lots of ways to think about that. So in sum, oh my gosh, I said in sum just when Julie came back up. Good. So in sum, what do survivors wish for? What they want is an opportunity to slow down, think with someone, even in the dangerous moment. And they want those someones to be a friend or family member who gets it, or an advocate in the context of a place to stay for a day or two. And I think they would not even mind it being the police if they could get that from the police, though usually most of them did not. So this wish for a listening ear in moments of crisis is so simple and at the same time so complex. I hope we have provided a bit of infrastructure for thinking about what might work in your community. And I really look forward to thinking with you about next steps. Thank you so much.
Wow. I think, can you unshare your screen? Incredible, incredible. Every time I hear this, I feel particularly struck by that, by the findings of just how important connection is to survivors, and that being seen and understood is just as much of a basic need as safety, food, water, transportation. And in some ways, being witnessed and being seen is even more essential to getting to those other basic needs. I'm going to remind everyone that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat now. We do have one from Karen, who said, with the study being mostly Black women, did any of those women report seeking help from the Black church?
Yeah, I can take that one. And by the way, I just put in the pod mapping link. That's such a good question. And the answer is no. And I think that there's two potential reasons for that. I mean, in my fantasy, there's the possibility that people who are really supported by the Black church are not finding themselves in this position. That's one possibility, are not needing to. I mean, remember, this sample mainly came from shelters or programs, not necessarily shelters, but from programs. So they were seeking help that they couldn't get elsewhere. And that's really important. Some were not, but most were. So that's one possibility. And then I don't know, or the other possibility, I think that maybe they had tried earlier and found it didn't help, but we also remember that we were asking about the emergency moment. And I'm not sure that would be a time when you would call the church. You could have a buddy system through your church. I mean, I think that that's a really cool idea, but no, people did not talk about their church.
I have a question about, and potentially this is the same of your scope was really that emergency situation, but listening to the study this time, I was really struck by the intergenerational component of your findings, that many people weren't reaching out for help because their family members were also experiencing domestic violence in one way or the other. And at Coburn Place, we have been thinking a lot about a 2-gen approach to our services and what that looks like. And I was curious if you two have seen in any of your studies or research findings a way to approach the whole family in moments of crisis or in support with domestic violence to kind of address that intergenerational cycle we see so frequently.
Deborah, do you want to start? I mean, I can also.
Sure. I mean, we, and this isn't really about moments of crisis, but we have done work talking to shelters about the ways in which the rules about confidentiality of shelter locations screen out families, and about changing those rules to bring families in to start to develop programs where families are present and are supportive. And even when there's intergenerational trauma, offering programs that support those who have experienced that intergenerational trauma, that trauma in a previous generation, and helping that be a source of connection rather than a source of disconnection, helping them gain some strength that they can lend to a person who's going through it now, as opposed to it being a place of vulnerability and overwhelm, so that they cannot provide that support. So we've talked to survivors and advocates at shelters about building out those programs to help with that, to help make that a source of strength rather than a source of disconnect.
Julie, it would be so cool if you did that. It would be a very innovative thing to think about survivors as 2 gen instead of 1, which of course, because that's how we don't think about ourselves in isolation, and yet most DV programs do think about survivors and their children in isolation. And it's such a disconnect. It's such a sort of unaligned approach, not aligned with how people actually live their lives. So Deborah mentioned that I had done a study a long time ago in a northeastern state where we did do focus groups with advocates about this. How do you secretly or on the edges and under the table do this sort of more network-oriented work? And a lot of them describe doing it, trying to maintain the confidentiality of the shelter, and at the same time doing phone coaching with pairs and trying to do it around the edges, but not really making it a centerpiece of their work.
Nichelle asks, that's so interesting. Thank you too for sharing that. And we'll keep you updated on how that goes. We'll ask your advice. Nichelle asks, so around this concept of like a physical, psychological respite that's neither a hotel or a shelter, do you have insight, or did participants have insight on how to keep them safe from abusers finding them during this?
Well, first of all, you probably all know better than we do. We're just like, we're not on the front lines like you are, but I know that, like in New York State, the model is that there are confidential shelters with an acknowledgement that such shelters are really no longer so confidential, just given social the way we can find people now. But they have what they call dwellings, which are they're not they're not institutionalized. They're just sort of like rooms in hotels that people can go to when they need it most. When I said that people don't want to just go to a hotel, what I mean is they don't want to go to a hotel only. They wouldn't mind going to a hotel if there was an advocate associated with it. What they don't want is just to be thrown out into some room. So it could be a constantly changing room. It doesn't have to be a room that's held, although that would be nicer. But especially if it was constantly changing, I don't see that an abuser would be able to find them for those 2 days. Or if it was something with if it's only one family at a time, ever using this, I think it's much more protected than a shelter where, every taxi driver in the city knows about the shelter. And kids are unable to keep it quiet with their friends at the school about where the shelter is and all that kind of thing. So those are a few thoughts.
We're getting close on time. Talking to you all and having questions and answers, I think is the best part. I have 2 more, and we'll see if we can get through them. Dawn asks, and just to put a little bit of this in context for you two, in Indianapolis from January to July, 18,000 domestic violence police runs were recorded. Someone correct me if I'm wrong that it's police calls and not runs. I'm misremembering which it is, but still 18,000 is just astronomical. And, so knowing that even when survivors don't prefer calling the police still remain the resource, right, for those emergent situations. So Dawn asks, since the police are still called a great deal of time, do you have suggestions on how we might get this information to law enforcement, especially that idea of the listening ear as being very critical? Or do you think domestic violence organizations would do better to focus capacity on the network enhancement, like how to equip family and friends on being that witness to survivors?
I'll start and then I want Deborah to jump in. But let me just say, first of all, both and. I mean, it's got to be both and. You can't just, you can't let go of the police yet. Maybe someday. But in the meantime, we absolutely need to be building up our informal networks. And as far as how to reach the police, Deborah will have more thoughts on this. But I just want to, from my experience, it's really nice to provide positive examples rather than just scold them on how really, really terrible they often are. And the survivors gave two gorgeous examples. One of them I asked, what was the best reaction you ever got? And they go, oh, the police, hands down. And they described a pair of police officers, one man, one woman, coming to the house, one person dealing with the abuser, one person taking her aside, and then realizing that it was the kids who really needed support in the moment, playing games on the floor, saying, I'll get to you in a second. We have all the time in the world, and sort of just really listening, really managing, and then really sort of doing, and then what survivor do you want to happen right now? Here's some possibilities that I can predict down the road about what would follow if you did this, that, or the other. So that's a nice example to show police officers. Here's what it would look like. Deborah?
Yeah, just super quick. I was going to say both, and I agree with everything Lisa said, of course. Here in DC, I have found that given the massive critique of policing that's been happening, police are much more open to information about what they can do better rather than what they are doing badly than they ever have been before. So I think there's a real opportunity there to do that work. And we've started, I guess we've always done this, sending letters of commendation when officers do things that are helpful to our client base, because in the policing system, those letters really matter for promotion, for pay, for all of those things. And writing a detailed letter about what an officer did that was good, I think changes that officer's behavior, but it also gets circulated broadly. So local stories are really helpful.
Yeah.
But we got to build up networks. Yeah.
Wow, this has been amazing. I think I will email Sarah's question to you since we're at time. I want to thank you all of the attendees who have come. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us, learning more about survivors and what they need when they seek help. This has just been such a thought-provoking conversation. Dr. Goodman, Dr. Epstein, thank you for coming. If you missed it, we will be sending out the recording of this conversation, and we'll also include a link to their published research findings so that you can check those out more in depth as well. And if you'd like to get more involved at Coburn Place, check us out at coburnplace.org and stay tuned for more Coburn conversations in the future. Thanks all.
Thank you so much.
Take care.